out there. I hope you are enjoying yourselves with our summit for this year. Breakout sessions were a little dicey in the beginning, but we got them all sorted out. Please be mindful that they are recorded, so you will be able to watch them at a later date that will get out there to the public. But we're so glad that you are continuing on with us for our keynote presentation. And for our second keynote presentation, we have Dr. Christena Cleveland with us, and she will be discussing Living Ghost, How America's Racial History Haunts Us Today. She will present a brief history of the U.S. racial DNA and share examples of how our collective history shapes our identities, behaviors, and Christian spirituality. So you won't want to miss this. We are so excited to have you with us, and we can already feel God's presence that has been with us throughout this whole summit thus far, and we know that that will continue. So before we bring on Dr. Cleveland, I just want to pray a prayer blessing over you all. Father God, we are just so thankful for your continued presence with us. We're so thankful for this opportunity to grow in knowledge, Lord. And I just pray that you continue to be with each and every delegate, Lord. Open up our hearts, our minds to receive your message that you have for us today and tomorrow, Lord. May you anoint your servant who is going to come and present to us, Lord. May you give her the words to speak that your children need to hear today. We pray this in your precious name. Amen.
Well, I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Christena Cleveland, and for those of you who are familiar with Dr. Cleveland, you will know that she is an amazing communicator, an amazing researcher, and I had the honor about 2 years ago, I had the honor of sitting under her teaching, and I had a week-long intensive, and I'm not exaggerating when I say this, but it forever changed my life, and it gave me a new perspective on many things, not just racial justice, but also in spiritual formation, as you will probably hear later on from Dr. Cleveland. Dr. Cleveland also knows the Army, as she has presented before. Some of you will recall that she was one of the presenters last year at the National Social Services Conference. So Dr. Cleveland is a social psychologist, a public theologian, author, and activist, and she is the founder and director of the recently launched Center for Justice and Renewal. And if you Google that, you will find more information on there, because I've done that before. And this is a nonprofit dedicated to helping justice advocates sharpen their understanding of the social realities that maintain injustice, while also stimulating the soul's enormous capacity to resist and transform those realities. Christena writes regularly. She speaks widely and consults with organizations, and she integrates psychology, theology, and art to stimulate our spiritual imagination. She has held various faculty positions, and one of the most recently ones was at Duke University's Divinity School, where she led a research team where they were investigating self-compassion as a buffer to racial stress, which is something that we really could learn from and really benefit from today. She has written various books. One of them that I highly recommend is one of her first books, which is Disunity in Christ, Uncovering the Hidden Forces That Keep Us Apart. So I invite you, I know it says on your programs, if you look on there, it says lunch and keynote. So sit back, relax, grab your snack or your meal, and don't worry, we're not going to see you. Your cameras are turned off, so don't be afraid of that. And for those of you on the East Coast, enjoy your New York-style pizza, your cheesesteak with that grease coming out of that paper bag, or lobster roll. West Coast, or Cobb salad. Central, pasties, and Chicago deep dish pizza. The Southern Territory, or the southern part of the U.S., po' boys, beignets, Dr. Pepper is what I hear is pretty big down there. Canada, your maple syrup, your Montreal-style bagels, ketchup chips, which I had never heard of and I probably would never try. but I'll stop right there because I'm getting pretty hungry. So we're going to go ahead and invite you to sit back. I invite you to just enter into maybe a discomfort as you hear some truths that maybe you haven't heard before. Be teachable. Just come humbly to invite God and His Word to come into our hearts. So I invite you now to welcome Dr. Christena Cleveland.
Good afternoon, everyone. Major, thank you for that wonderful introduction and exhortation. A perfect segue into a prayer that I'd like to begin with this afternoon. It is a prayer for honoring risk, and it's by Choctaw spiritual teacher Pixie Lighthouse. And so this is about a 3-minute prayer. I'd love for you to just take a few deep breaths, let out whatever you need to let out on the out breath, because as was mentioned, we can't see you. You can do whatever you want to get comfortable, and just allow the liturgy to wash over you. This is a prayer for honoring risk by Pixie Lighthorse. Thank you for this perfect day, for taking chances. Bless the heart which steps into the light tunnel of alternative channels of thinking. Help us to understand that keeping quiet keeps us small. Guide us to compose our ideas and thoughts without worry about who will respond and how. Help us open to the rejection or neutrality that may come from expressing our initial ideas and feelings. Show us the real hazards, but keep us from making up artificial ones that prevent forward movement. Help us gather the thoughts that come from our hearts. Support us as we face the unknown. Strengthen our relationship to uncertainty by making pyramids of our foundation. Remind us that we are like those who have gone before us, stepping out of the comfort zone in order to engage possibility. Redirect our fears and place our feet on the path in front of us. Give us a nudge when we need it. Help us to be bold examples to others who look to us to lead with faith. Spread our arms wide, open our heart wider, and let us find out for ourselves. Grow our options for speaking from love. Help the healing medicine rise to meet our voices. Remind us that there are no healing reasons to protect those who have done harm. Help us to say the things no one can say for us. Let us remember that our admissions of what is true are as important to our own ears as they are to anyone who listens. We are ready to pioneer new ways for ourselves. Pave our roads with clarity and trust. Mark the trail with feathers and tracks for exploring all avenues of curiosity. May our continuous efforts fortify our habit of speaking up for ourselves. May our vow to try as many times as necessary reveal the promise of our freedom. May our mistakes be our teachers. Help us to reframe those things we wish to have said more clearly and truthfully. Let us grant ourselves second and third opportunities. Encourage us to stick our necks out, not onto the chopping block, but to stretch ourselves to beautiful lengths in order to greet what's ahead. Amen and Ashe, as they say in my West African roots. That was Honoring Risk by Pixie Lighthorse. 2020 has been a year for risk. 2020 has been a year for sticking our necks out, not on the chopping block, but as an opportunity to see what's possible. And I know one of the big news highlights this year has been ongoing Black genocide, ongoing Black pain, ongoing harm to Black folks. And this year has made me have a lot of flashbacks to the first year that I became aware as a young woman, a young adult, about the problem of racism in the United States. I grew up in a pretty sheltered family. We didn't talk a lot about race, even though it was a Black family. We were sheltered in some ways from some of the harm because we're middle class. I later learned that I wasn't entirely sheltered and protected, that class doesn't save me from being a Black woman. But as I was growing up, I wasn't as aware until the year after I graduated high school. It was 1999. It was just a little munchkin. I was actually living in Spain doing some volunteer work for the year. I was doing a gap year. And you may remember it was similar to George Floyd this year, but there was a huge, huge, huge news cycle, an outroar about the unarmed killing of a Black man named Amadou Diallo. And that name might ring a bell for some of you who are old enough to remember. It was a similar story, just as tragic, and it was an awakening for me. And this is the way the story goes. Amadou Diallo was an immigrant. He was an African immigrant. He was working hard, dark-skinned Black brother, living in New York City. And this was the time of a lot of racial profiling and police brutality in New York City. Rudy Giuliani was the mayor at the time, and he was given a lot of credit for kind of cleaning up New York City. But a lot of the police tactics that were used to do that so-called cleanup involved racial profiling. So there was a lot of fear in the Black community of being profiled, of being arrested, frisked, harassed simply because of the color of your skin, being seen as a threat automatically. So Amadou Diallo was coming home from work late one night. He was a short order cook at a local restaurant. And he's walking down the street and 4 white police officers call out to him and say, "Stop, we need to talk to you." Now, of course, Amadou is scared. He knows that this cannot be good news. So instead of stopping and trusting the police, because as I've learned, the police are not often trustworthy, he ran. He ran the other direction. And he ran down the block to his apartment, ran up the steps to his apartment. It was a second floor apartment. And there was a porch light on in his apartment. And so when he was about to open the door, the police said, "Stop, you better stop now." So he does. He puts his hands up in the air, and he's backlit by the porch lights. All they can see is his silhouette. And he starts to reach into his pocket in order to pull out his wallet to show his identification. He's not the person that they're looking for, just coming home after a hard day at work, just trying to live his life. But when they see him reach into his pocket to pull out his wallet, which is what he does actually pull out, they claim that he was pulling out a gun, that they thought he was pulling out a gun. And so they shot him. 4 white armed police officers shot 1 unarmed Black man. And they shot him, and again, and again, and again, and again. And they shot him 41 times before they stopped shooting. And so he died that night, and there was uproar because he wasn't the person they were looking for. He was unarmed. He was brutally murdered. They didn't trust him when he said he was pulling out his wallet. And of course, these 4 white police officers swore that it was a gun. We could have sworn it was a gun. We saw a gun. That's what we saw. It was a huge error, a huge mistake. We didn't mean to. And that was the news story that moved me into a space where I was awakened and willing to start taking some of the very risks. Learning about what's really going on in this world, not just to people like me, but to others. Getting into the advocacy work. Examining myself, my own perceptions, my own actions, how I'm complicit. I'm a social psychologist, and one of the things that's fabulous about our discipline, there are many things that are fabulous about us, but one of the things that's fabulous about our discipline is that we often follow the zeitgeist of what's going on. And so we're often asking questions that help us understand what's going on in the world around us. And so, of course, after this Amadou Diallo travesty, oppression, anti-Blackness happened, social psychologists started studying what was really going on. How do we make sense of the fact that here we have this horribly brutal situation where a Black man was murdered by 4 white police officers, and also there are these white police officers who claim that it was unintentional, that they did not think he was pulling out a wallet. And so one of the things that's really neat about social psychology is we think a lot about non-conscious processes, non-conscious behaviors, how we perceive the world in ways that we don't even know we're perceiving the world. And so there was a social psychologist at the time, just after 1999, who started studying this in particular. His name's Keith Payne. And he put together a study where he wanted to ask the question, test the hypothesis. How do people automatically perceive Black men relative to white men? Separate from what they might claim to say they believe about race, separate from who they might vote for, separate from what neighborhood they live in, separate from what nonprofits they donate to, separate from what kind of church they go to. When it comes down to a split-second decision, you don't have a lot of time to make this decision, you don't have a lot of resources to make this decision consciously. What are you going to do? How are you going to perceive people? And so he put together this fascinating study where what he did was he showed participants a subliminal picture of either a Black man or a white man. Now, subliminal means that the participants are able to perceive that. Okay, so let me go back to this. Subliminal means that your consciousness has been presented with some information, but you can't consciously say that you were presented with that information. So it flies in under the radar. Anything that's presented to us at less than about 200, 300 milliseconds, we won't be able to say we saw it. It'll flash so fast before us that consciously we can't say, oh, I saw something. However, research shows that it impacts us. On a non-conscious level, we're able to receive that information. And so he wanted to set up a situation that was clearly racialized, but without people knowing this is about race. Because people start to get defensive when it's about race, and people start to act like they're further along on their anti-racism journey than they really are when it comes to race. So he presented a subliminal image of either a Black man or a white man. Now remember, participants didn't see this image. They just saw something flash on the screen. Then he presented people with either a picture of a gun or a tool. Now that was not subliminal. It was flashed very, very, very quickly, but not so quickly that people couldn't say, oh, I saw something. And really his question was, what did you see? Did you see a gun or did you see a tool? So he paired a subliminal Black image with a gun. So if you could show the next slide, next. The first thing he did was pair a subliminal Black image with a gun. And then he paired a subliminal Black image with a tool, next. And then he presented a white face subliminally with a gun. And then he presented a white face subliminally with a tool. So these were the pairings. And what's so interesting about this is that all the participants said, I couldn't see a face at all. So clearly this is a racial situation, but they weren't able to report that. They weren't able to say that. And the researchers just said, do the best you can. Make your best judgment as fast as possible. Is this a gun or a tool that you saw? And what they found, their research results were fascinating. They were published in about 2001, so just after the Amadou Diallo tragedy. And they found that when participants were presented subliminally with a Black face first, they were more likely to misidentify the tool as a gun. But when they were presented with a white face subliminally, they were more likely to misidentify a gun as a tool. And so the researchers concluded that people, on average, see Black men as dangerous, associate Black men with danger. They're carrying a tool, they're associated with a tool, but people see it as a gun. And people associate white men with safety, maybe some industriousness. And this study was replicated hundreds of times in all different populations, all different races. If we've grown up in North America, we've grown up in Western Europe, there's a good chance that we have the same bias. We automatically see Black men as dangerous and white men as safe. Now, my brother was a graduate student at Yale. He was actually he was going to Yale Divinity School when I told him about this study and shared the research with him. And, you know, my brother's African American, just like me, we're biological siblings. And I said to him, how fascinating is this, you know, that this is the perception automatically, and we're starting to understand it a little bit more. And he looked at me, we were FaceTiming so I could see his face, and I just saw one tear fall down his eye, and down his cheek from his eye, and he said, why would anybody ever bother doing that research? Anyone who lives in this society in a Black male body knows that we are hunted, that we are seen as dangerous first, that we are the ones that the police are constantly suspicious of, and not just the police, all of society. And he told me something that I didn't know about his experience there. He said, you know, in just the last semester, just walking home from the divinity school, 2 blocks to my apartment, I've been stopped and frisked by the New Haven police 4 times. 4 times. So class doesn't save us from these systems of oppression, these systems of anti-Blackness. And oftentimes we look at the Keith Payne study and we say, okay, so that maybe explains why the police officers took that first shot. We all have been inducted into a society where we perceive people negatively based on their skin color. And we see them as a threat. And so, sure, it makes sense that maybe they saw a gun instead of a wallet. But how did they get to this point where they were shooting 41 times? That's not an error. That's not an uh-oh, oopsie. That is a deep, internalized anti-Blackness and brutality. And there's a lot more research in social psychology on what happens when we have these perceptions and there's also a power difference. Sure, of course, people of all races have perceptions and stereotypes of people of other races, but not everyone has guns and are called law enforcement. Not everyone has the power to act in really discriminatory ways. And there's more research in social psychology on this topic, on this very topic. Yes, these perceptions, these negative perceptions are terrible, and they also devolve into something so much more. Not only do our perceptions impact how we treat people, they actually impact whether we even see them as human, whether we see that their life actually matters or not. And this is a term called infrahumanization. So you can put up the next slide. Infrahumanization. It's actually a very, very slick way that we learn to dehumanize other people without even knowing that we are dehumanizing them. This is how it works. We apply uniquely human characteristics to our group. We ascribe our group with those uniquely human characteristics. The implication being that the other group does not have these uniquely human characteristics. The implication being they're not quite human in the way that we are. They're just a little bit less human. So let me give you an example of how this works. If you can show the next slide. This is an image of a group of young Black men putting together a Molotov cocktail to throw at the police in Ferguson, Missouri, in response to the police brutality there. And oftentimes, people, particularly white people or people who have been inducted into whiteness, will look at this image and say something like, well, I would feel guilty if I were responding to violence with violence. Now, that's an interesting statement, and it's a great example of infrahumanization, because guilt and shame are deeply moral emotions, and they're actually what distinguish human beings from other animals. We are able to experience guilt. We are able to experience shame because we are moral. We respond and embody morality. And so a statement like that might not sound like it's that bad. Well, I would feel guilty if I were responding to violence with violence. Is actually dehumanizing because it's describing this human characteristic, this possibility of carrying guilt to me. And without even saying it, it's dehumanizing the other. Saying, well, they're not capable of guilt. They don't feel shame. They're not moral. They're not quite human. If you can show the next slide. So we see images like these. These are kids throwing rocks in Baltimore at the police. The next slide. Another man who's involved in a response to police brutality. And the media gives us plenty of these images and opportunities to infrahumanize. And rather than listening to the words of Martin Luther King Jr., who says, the riot is the language of the unheard, we often respond out of this internalized dehumanization of Black people. Well, they're just slightly less human, and it's so sneaky that we do it without even explicitly saying that. We just say, well, I would feel guilty if I did that. There is another way. And I wish I could say, as someone who grew up in the Christian church, as someone who's written books about divisions in the church, as someone who's worked a lot and consulted a lot in churches, Christian churches, I wish I could say that the church was on the forefront. I wish I could say that people whose spirituality is rooted in Christianity are on the forefront of humanizing people, of justice work, of saying, yes, your life matters. No, I will not stand for this. Yes, I will uproot anything in me that I have internalized from this society that makes me even consider that you're less human. I wish I could say that, and certainly there's theology, Christian theology and spirituality to support that. And I want to share one short piece from scripture that the Apostle Paul offers us, Philippians 2. If our life in Christ means anything to you, if God's love or the Spirit that we have in common, or any tenderness or sympathy can persuade you at all, then be united in your convictions and united in your love with a common purpose and a common mind. That is the one thing that would make me completely happy. There must be no competition among you, no conceit, but everybody is to be humble. Value others over yourselves. Each of you think of the interests of the others before your own. Mm, that is some inspiring language. No competition among you, no conceit, no competition among you. So when people say Black Lives Matter, that means not responding with all life, but all lives matter. That's competition. No conceit. Everybody to be humble. Everybody to say, actually, I don't really know much about your experience. If I'm not a Black man, I don't know your experience. Tell me about it. I'm not going to tell you how you should respond to something. I'm going to be humble. I'm going to listen. I'm going to stand in solidarity. I'm going to keep saying, tell me more until I understand, until I'm as angry as you are, until I'm ready to walk into this space with you. That is the architecture of spirituality that Paul has given those of us who are rooted in Christian spirituality. But somehow the church or the army, the Salvation Army, is not at the forefront of this. We have the spirituality, we've got the ideology, we've even got the example of Jesus, but somehow we're struggling. We aren't the ones who are able to move forward in this love that's been modeled by the Trinity, full of equality, full of mutuality, full of collaboration, full of oneness. And this is in part because the church, particularly the Christian church, but I would argue most organized religion in the United States, is complicit in the racial hierarchies. So we're going to move on to the next slide. Rather than being against them, rather than being revolutionaries against them, we are complicit in these racial hierarchies. And the main racial hierarchy that I want to talk about today for the rest of our time is the problem of whiteness, the problem of racial hierarchies. Obviously, there are social hierarchies that make this a little bit more complex. But I want to talk to you specifically about whiteness and where it came from. Where did we get this idea that a white man is safe and a Black man is dangerous? Where do we get this idea that Black lives don't matter as much? Because that's actually a deeply moral and spiritual idea, that some people are more sacred than others. It is deeply moral and spiritual to participate in hierarchies like our justice system, like our capitalistic economic system, like our religious systems that privilege white men and the voices of white people over others. That is a deeply moral thing, because what it is saying is that we think some people are more sacred than others. We think that some people's ideas are more sacred than others. We think that some people's stories are more sacred than others. And so this is a deeply moral question. How is it that whiteness became the top of the hierarchy here in North America, and Blackness was pushed to the bottom of the hierarchy? Well, there's always a story behind the story. And in this case, the first time that race was talked about in the United States in the way that we understand race was compliments of good old Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was, as you know, one of the framers of the Declaration of Independence. He was a slave owner. He, at the height of his slaveholding capacity, had over 700 slaves on his plantation. I tend to call plantations labor camps, though I tend to call slave owners human traffickers, because that's what they were. And so he was, by any standard, a very prominent, prolific human trafficker on his labor camp. And it was a large labor camp. The average labor camp during antebellum had 1 or 2 enslaved Africans. Thomas Jefferson's had about 700. So we're talking a massive, massive oppressive operation at play over him. He was the overlord. And in his book, it's the only book he ever wrote. It's called Notes on the State of Virginia. It was published in 1781. I do not recommend it, but I did due diligence and I did read it. He was writing this book at the same time that he was also writing the Declaration of Independence. And so as you're reading this book, it's about the state of Virginia, his home state, and he's talking about the property of Virginia. And he's talking about the hills and the valleys. He's talking about the Shenandoah Valley. He's talking about the Blue Ridge Mountains. He has a whole section on livestock and the animals. And then he moves to the human property, the enslaved Africans. And he starts to describe the human property. And you can even sense in his writing that he's experiencing some cognitive dissonance. Because on the one hand, he's just written this Declaration of Independence and Bill of Rights, where he is proclaiming every human, every man is equal. Everyone should have access to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He had recently just come back from France, been enlightened, learned about the revolution, and he was a changed man. He had all these convictions. All lives should matter. It's written in the Declaration of Independence, sort of. Meanwhile, he has this massive labor camp, and he's a human trafficker. And clearly these lives don't matter. These lives don't get to have access to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so he's writing about them in this book, these enslaved, my ancestors. And he starts to piece together an actual ideology of race. It's the early example we have of race in terms of the way it's understood here in the United States, which is black and white as two sides of the spectrum. And he articulates this modern concept of race. And then he starts describing all of the enslaved people in a way that is against and under whiteness. So he's describing the physical characteristics of my ancestors, the intellectual characteristics, and he's always doing it in a way that is less than the white people. And this is the first time that we see this contrast where whiteness is inherently better, more pure, more intelligent, more capable, more beautiful than blackness. And he even takes time talking about the physical characteristics of my female ancestors in just very dehumanizing and lewd ways, comparing them to the physical characteristics of white women. They are setting up an antagonism between white femininity and black femininity. And it's all laid out in this book. In every way, in every characteristic, black people are less human than white people. And the white people are the standard of humanity. Therefore, they shouldn't have access to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, these black folks, because they're not quite human. Dissonance solved. Yes, on the one hand, I can believe that every human should have access to these rights, but they're not quite human. There's my ideology of race. That's how I make it work. And this is what he did. And that whole way of thinking, that whole philosophy was at the foundation of this country. And we see it everywhere. White Christ was a staple on the plantation. And I want to show you the next slide. And you see now this white Christ from the most recent Jesus movie, blonde hair, dirty blonde hair, blue eyes. And on the left, you see the earliest known image of Jesus, which was created in 235, the year 235. It's an Egyptian Coptic image, and as you can see, Christ is black, surrounded by black and brown people. And actually, it wasn't until about the 5th century that we began to see white images of Christ and Mary. Up until that point, they were all black and brown. The earliest images were all black and brown. But because Thomas Jefferson and cronies needed to justify the enslavement and the brutality of Black people, they invented white Jesus. They invented white Christ. And that's an example of the way whiteness works and has been carried forth in the church, because the church had to be complicit in the enslavement and the trafficking of Black people. The church had to participate in that in order for it to work. And this was one of the church's many contributions and partnerships with white supremacy and whiteness, this idea that everything that whites do and everything that white culture produces is inherently more valuable than Blackness. One particular way that this shows up in Christian organizations like the Army, in Christian organizations like Christian colleges, and even beyond Christian organizations, just in organizations that are ruled by whiteness. And actually the study that I'm going to share with you is about not just Christian organizations, but just how whiteness shows up in organizations. So let's take a look at the next slide. And this is a really interesting study that was done on how whiteness is heroicized and shows up in leadership. You know, we often ask questions like, well, you know, if everyone's perspective matters, then why is it that in large organizations or small organizations, but if we're talking about a large one like the Army, why is it that the vast majority of the leaders are all white? Why is it that the vast majority of the leaders are all white males? Why is it that the leaders who do not show up in a white male body but want to move ahead need to approximate the characteristics and values of the leaders who show up in white bodies? Why? What is that? How is it that we've started to equate whiteness with leadership? It's not just white Jesus. It's not just white people are inherently better, but it's also white leadership is heroicized. And the people who practice these characteristics are more likely to get promoted, are more likely to move ahead. And so this was a study that was done that looked at particularly how whiteness, the whiter your leadership style is, the more it's seen as legitimate leadership. Whiteness is heroicized. And so in this particular study, they're looking at leadership as heroicized and racialized. And what they did is they took, this was a study that was conducted in Australia a few years ago, and they looked at how white philanthropists were presented in the Australian media. And what they did is they looked for references, specific references to whiteness. Now, for example, people who study whiteness have found that there are three really common factors of whiteness. One is normalization, and that is that whatever the white people are doing is automatically considered normalized. And so if white people, you know, eat their chicken unseasoned, that's the normal way. And so anybody else who seasons their chicken, that's seen as over-seasoned because the white way is the standard way. If white people like to put raisins in their potato salad, that's seen as the normal way. And anybody who does things differently is seen as an outlier to the standard. So that's one of the things that they were looking for in this study. They were also looking for solipsism, which is an example of extreme individualism, kind of that like heroic, I'm just going to go forth and conquer, but kind of do it on my own, rugged, individualistic. I'm kind of perceived as the lone hero. That's a very strong characteristic of whiteness. People of color communities tend to be much more collaborative, tend to rely less on kind of like one Moses figure to save everyone, and it's much more of a group effort, collective effort. And then the last thing they were looking at was expansiveness. The term is called ontological expansiveness, but in my writing, in my work, I talk about it as white sprawl, because that's a little bit easier to understand. And basically it's this idea that we've been taught, if those of us who've been shaped by whiteness, chaplained by whiteness, have been taught that what we need to do is go forth and become an expert on everything, prove that not even prove, just assume that we belong everywhere. It's a very colonial impulse that in order to move forward, you have to advance into new territory. And so this is an example of whiteness where you see white folks moving into low-income neighborhoods to do good. And the assumption is that their presence there is good. Their assumption is that they're qualified to be there. Their assumption is that the skills and the resources that they bring are actually wanted. The assumption is that they're wanted. It's all this expansiveness. Whiteness just expands into everything. And so it's difficult for people who've been inducted in a whiteness, chaplain in a whiteness, to even admit that they don't have the answers, that they aren't experts on something, or that they can't become experts on something, that they're disqualified, because whiteness teaches them, go forth and conquer, go west, young man. This is literally what it means to be human, is to colonize. And so they wanted to look at how the media represents these 12 white philanthropists, looking to see how is this type of leadership, this normalization, this solipsism, this expansiveness, heroicized? How is this seen as good and even moral? And one of the things they found was that individuals in the sample were so interesting because they had formal positions of authority. You know, this person is a well-known lawyer, and so, you know, in his field, he's actually an expert. This person is a well-known physician, and so in his field, he's actually an expert. He's a leader in his field. But what was really interesting that they found is that just by giving money away, their philanthropic activity was seen as leadership. So they're not experts at philanthropic work. They're just people who have money and are giving it away. But that's seen as leadership. It's already seen as moral. It's already seen as heroic, even though they haven't done anything to be qualified to be seen as leaders. Another finding they had, and you can move on to the next slide, is this idea that the white leaders speak for all of society. They're normalized. There were 3 Jewish participants, and their Jewish identity was named. But all the other participants and all of their causes, no one ever mentioned they were white. It was just normalized. Now, if this had been a Black philanthropist, they would have said, Black philanthropist so-and-so did this. But that wasn't the case. Every single person who was in this study was white, but their whiteness was never named because it was so normalized. Another thing is they were portrayed as moral leaders, not just leaders, but moral leaders and saviors, speaking for not only all white Australians, but all Australians, including the Indigenous population. And so there was one man, Greg Posh, who donated $10 million to an Indigenous project. And this is him talking about the project. This is a white man talking about his work. We are doing pretty well as non-Indigenous people, and we're living in a country where I think we owe something to Indigenous people. There's been a feeling of frustration and helplessness at the plight of Indigenous Australians. So he's speaking for them. He says, now there's a way forward. He's saying, I gave $10 million, now there's a way forward. Hopefully, people with a social conscience and the wherewithal might step up to the plate. They're certainly needed. Then he goes on to say, but our generation didn't cause the problems of Indigenous health and housing. It's not our fault. But that's not a practical approach to solving the problems. We have a responsibility. Non-Indigenous Australians are the only people who can fix this up through governments and through initiatives like mine. So he's speaking on behalf of Indigenous folks, on their feelings, on their experiences. He's absolving himself. He's saying, if we can fix this, I'm not responsible for the pain, but I'm going to fix it. I'm absolving myself and all white Australians. And he's taking over because it's normal for the leader to do that. Another finding they have, next slide, is that these white leaders can master all environments. This is the expansiveness, the white sprawl, just moving in to these spaces. They can master all of the environments and just expand into them. One of the philanthropists was a man named Graham Tuckwell. And he donated $50 million to create scholarships for 25 people from under-resourced communities. And they were going to be called Tuckwell Scholars. They were each going to get $20,000 a year for 5 years. And he has taken it upon himself to choose who these people are going to be. Now, is he an expert in higher ed and a student's ability to, succeed in a higher ed environment? Nope, he's just a rich man who's decided that he's going to be the one to choose these 25 scholars. Is he an expert on being under-resourced? Has he done all this research? Has he ever been under-resourced? No, none of those things. But still, the scholarship is named after him, so he is going to pick the next 25 Tuckwell scholars. And this is what he says about that. He is looking for scholars who display a well-rounded set of personal attributes and exhibit the Tuckwell values of integrity, humility, and generosity, who demonstrate academic and social achievement and a commitment to Australia and a desire to give back to the nation. He later adds that he wants to avoid hothouse kids, which is Australian vernacular for a little bit, showing a little bit too much of your under-resourced formation, your urban formation. He wants to avoid that. And he wants to support those who are bright, engaged, and ready to work hard, who are innately smart and generous of spirit and have the enormous fire in their belly. So even though he has left the area of Australia where they are hoping to recruit these scholars for this award, he's going to return back once a year just to pick them. And he does not have any expertise, but he wants to create something kind of like the Rhodes Scholarship, which they have at the University of Oxford. So what's really interesting is how much he is seen as someone who's actually qualified to do this work, to make these decisions, to evaluate. And that's just a really great example of how whiteness often teaches people that they can be experts, that they can move into any situation and with power determine who's valuable and who's not, who's sacred and who's not, who deserves a chance and who's not. And more often than not, just like Graham Tuckwell, they're looking for people who display the values that are inherent to them. And so when someone in the Army wants to maybe mentor an up-and-coming person, they're going to be looking for someone who exhibits characteristics that are just like them. And those are the characteristics of whiteness. And that's how certain people move ahead, but not others. One other finding from this study before we take a turn towards theology and close out for this session, they saw this, not only did people like Graham Tuckwell claim their expertise and act on their expertise in ways that actually significantly impacted other people. They shared that these men often took pictures of themselves that depicted them expanding into other cultures, going forth and conquering other cultures as white men. So if you can show the next slide, here's an example of Harold Mitchell, one of the philanthropists. This was an actual official publicity photo of this philanthropist. And as you can see in the background, there is indigenous art in graffiti form in the background. But he's in the foreground and he's lit. And so he's standing and sort of staking his claim in front of this indigenous art to which he does not belong. The next slide. Here's Andrew Forrest, another one. Again, this is an official publicity photo of this philanthropist who is in the study. Here we see him kind of doing a jiggy with a brown-skinned, presumably indigenous person. As you can see, the light is on him compared relative to the indigenous person. He's the one who's ontologically kind of taking up space here. He's the focus of the image, but he's also extracting from this brown man who is clearly secondary in terms of the lighting and even the aura around Andrew Forrest, which suggests that he's the one bringing good and light to this man. So these are just some examples of how these historic contributions from people like Thomas Jefferson, from the institution of slavery, from the institution of white Jesus, impact how we even perceive leadership in organizations. And in my breakout session this afternoon, we're going to actually use a model that helps us look to see who thrives in this organization and who languishes in marginalization simply because of the way that they show up in the world and types of characteristics. But for now, I just want to talk about the theological problem of this. As we mentioned earlier, Paul gave us this tool, this really powerful and beautiful idea of love, what real unified love looks like. And in Philippians 2, he does something that I didn't highlight back then, but I want to highlight now as we talk about the problem of this. What's so interesting is that when Paul introduces Philippians 2, and I know a lot of you are familiar with this passage, and you can always look it up later if you want to return to it. When he introduces this incredible love, this love where we look out for the interests of others first, this love where we're not defensive, this love where we're really kind of willing to own our contribution. We're willing to say, actually, if you're feeling like your life doesn't matter, I'm going to take that seriously. I'm going to stand with you in that. When he introduces that love, he starts by introducing the Trinity. It actually is a little subtle, but he starts by saying, by mentioning the love of God, the unity in the Spirit, and the connection to Jesus. He mentions the Trinity at the very beginning, inviting us into a thinking around this mutuality of the Trinity. And theologians call that perichoresis. Perichoresis is what Paul is talking about, this mutual indwelling of the Trinity, where the three members are so connected to each other that one indwells the other. We only understand God because Christ indwells God. Separate from the relationship that God has with Christ, we would cease to understand God. We only understand the Spirit because Christ indwells the Spirit and the Spirit indwells Christ. The interdependence is so intertwined, is so magical, that they would cease to exist outside of relationship with each other. They're distinct, but their interdependence is so important that they become their full selves in the context of relationship with each other. They self-actualize in the context of relationship with each other. These mutual, non-hierarchical identities come together as one. And what's really interesting about that to me as a social psychologist is that when we begin to see and participate in that type of perichoresis, which is at the center of Christian spirituality, we also become our most human selves. The way that we've been shaped by whiteness, the way that even people like me in black skin, brown skin have been shaped and impacted by growing up in this society where blackness is seen as less than whiteness. Blackness is something that is less holy, less sacred, less valuable than whiteness, less seen as having leadership potential. That makes us all less human. And so we can never participate in what Paul's inviting us into, this perichoresis, this mutual indwelling, this I am my most human self, because I am allowing your experiences, including your systemic pain, to shape me, to change me, unless we walk away from that whole concept of ontological expansiveness, that whole concept of white sprawl, where, oh, I can just go into any situation and be an expert. Put me in front of the art of the people who created this. I'll just stand and dominate the space. Let me just use other people to make myself look good. Let me just normalize my experience in order to really participate in perichoresis and what Paul's inviting us into, to really start taking risks with our faith. We have to deal with this problem of whiteness. The way that we have been shaped, especially white people, but it's in the air because this is a white dominant society, the way that we have been shaped to, during a split second time, little resources, little information, automatically assume that black is dangerous and white is safe. That black is unholy and white is holy. That black is unintelligent and white is intelligent. That's the work that we all have to do as individuals and as organizations, broader religious systems, in our families. This is the problem that we have inherited. So I want to end by just reading again what Paul invites us into in Philippians 2. And why don't you just take a moment to take a couple of deep breaths and just allow this liturgy to wash all over you. This is Philippians 2. If our life in Christ means anything to you, if God's love or the Spirit that we have in common, or any tenderness or sympathy can persuade you at all, then be united in your convictions and united in your love with a common purpose and a common mind. There is one thing that would make me completely happy. There must be no competition among you, no conceit, but everyone is to be humble, value others over yourselves. Each of you think of the interests of the others before your own. Amen and Ashe. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cleveland. Remember how I invited all of us to arrive to this keynote session? I have a question for all of us. Anyone out there feeling some discomfort, some anger, sadness, confusion, maybe some hopelessness? I invite you to pay attention and wrestle with what you've heard, how you feel up to this point. I invite you to ask more questions. I invite you to listen more. I invite you to recognize the fact that we don't know what we don't know. And I don't know if it's the same for you, but it's often exhausting to read and hear the overload of information and the versions, different versions of truth, and my side and your side of the truth. And we see it in Facebook, we see it through Twitter and Instagram. I get to the point where I say, I want less monologues and I want a lot more dialogue. Even those hard conversations, because they're so needed. I want us to be able to enter, as Jesus Emmanuel entered this world, we need to enter into each other's world. And I really believe that we as an army can do this. So continue talking, continue asking questions. We're going to continue on for the rest of this day. Just going to give you a heads up that the next breakout session will be at 1:45, so you can follow those links on there, and we're going to have a great time of prayer and lament at 3:30. And then we have a keynote tonight at 6 p.m. with Major Dr. Platt again. So I invite you to continue to attend, continue to open your heart and your mind to all that is being shared. And again, pay attention to how we are feeling. I want to close our time now with a Franciscan prayer of blessing. I use it quite a bit, actually. It's one of my favorite prayers. And I think it's going to show up there on the slide, and I'm going to pray this blessing over each and every one of us today. May God bless you with discomfort at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships so that you may live deep within your heart. May God bless you with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people so that you may work for justice, freedom, and peace. May God bless you with tears to shed for those who suffer pain, rejection, hunger, and war, so that you may reach out your hand to comfort them and to turn their pain to joy. Amen. May God richly bless you today.